Our topic tonight is building partnerships to limit the spread of terrorism in Africa. People have a wide variety of notions about how to best cope with terrorism, how to define it, how to identify where our national interests are, to be sure, and some discussion and disagreements quite often about methods which can be employed. But in any case, it's a major concern of the United States, and we're devoting considerable resources in Africa now to that particular enterprise. So it's a matter of interest to all who are concerned with the national interests of the United States. Our guest this evening, we're very fortunate, has been the primary person, I think, within the Bureau of African Affairs, responsible for the oversight of our counterterrorism operations there. The brief summary of the career of our guest is a graduate of the University of Virginia with his major in foreign affairs, joined the State Department, I believe, shortly after graduation from UVA. Early postings in the Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Lebanon. And later, and strikingly, service in Somalia during those very, very difficult years of 92 to 94. Later postings to Sudan, where for a while I believe you were chargé d'affaires, and then opened the embassy once we reestablished links to Sudan. Deputy Chief of Mission in Uganda, and then at the National Security Council was in charge, had the portfolios of East, Central, and South Africa and HIV/AIDS. Later became the DCM in South Africa, a major post, and ambassador to Ghana, before returning to the United States and assuming his present post as Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. He brings an absolutely apt background. It's a topic we're interested in. We're pleased and honored. It's my pleasure to present Ambassador Donald Teitelbaum.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and let me thank all of you for taking time out to engage with me tonight, and let me also especially thank our anonymous donor, if that donor is here, for making this possible. And especially thank you for giving me the chance to talk to you tonight to discuss a very important and timely subject: the U.S. support for Africa's fight against the spread of violent extremism. Unfortunately, while public attention in recent years has often focused on terrorist threats in other parts of the world, Africa has not been spared from deadly and indiscriminate attacks by violent extremists. In East Africa, Al-Qaeda operatives have historically used Somalia as a safe haven from which to launch attacks in the Horn of Africa. Deadly attacks on the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998, and I was, by the way, assigned to the embassy in Nairobi in 1998, and lost about 4 dozen friends in that attack, along with, of course, many hundreds of innocent Kenyans outside the embassy. A strike against an Israeli jetliner in Kenya in 2002, and 2 suicide bombings during the 2010 World Cup celebrations in Uganda demonstrated the seriousness of this threat to Americans and to Africans alike. To an extent, Africa has proven remarkably resistant to Al-Qaeda attempts to exploit its territory as staging points for attacks, safe havens, and recruiting bases. The tactics and ideology of violent extremism have been rejected by the vast majority of Africans, and African governments have repeatedly demonstrated their determination to disrupt and deter efforts by violent extremists to exploit the region's peoples and resources. The U.S. continues to enjoy strong relations with the vast majority of African countries, and polling demonstrates a vast reserve of goodwill among African peoples towards Americans and the United States. Nonetheless, While terrorism isn't a generalized threat throughout Africa, Al-Qaeda and other violent extremist groups continue to actively seek to mobilize recruits and launch attacks by exploiting weak governance, inadequate service delivery, poor security capacity, economic dislocation, and largely ungoverned spaces in West and East Africa. Violent extremists and terrorist organizations take advantage of corrupt officials and institutions, porous borders, marginalized populations, and poorly governed spaces in parts of Africa to resource and plan operations. In East Africa, al-Shabaab and affiliated foreign fighters continue to undertake asymmetric attacks in Somalia and to pursue attacks in neighboring Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, including against U.S. and other international interests. Illicit trafficking and migration between Yemen and Somalia, as well as the large numbers of Somali refugees throughout the Horn of Africa, enable extremist networks to transfer money, exchange tactics, and relocate fighters between Al-Qaeda, the Arabian Peninsula, and al-Shabaab in Somalia. In West Africa, the security environment in the Sahel requires sustained attention to address a wide range of vulnerabilities and capacity deficits. There's insufficient government capacity to monitor and protect immense swaths of remote, arid, and therefore largely ungoverned or poorly governed territory. The arid northern half of Mali alone covers an area larger than Texas. Niger is among the poorest countries in the world, according to the United Nations Development Program, and Mauritania and Mali also rank near the bottom of the Human Development Index. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and associated violent extremist groups exploited Mali's political crisis in 2012 and the influx of arms, supplies, and fighters from Libya to temporarily expand safe havens in northern Mali. While the subsequent intervention by African and French forces in Mali in January of this year has pushed AQIM fighters back to isolated outposts in northern Mali, the region remains vulnerable to violent extremism due to ongoing insecurity in Mali and Libya, the ability of fighters from Mali to find refuge in the security vacuum in southern Libya for the duration of the African and French intervention, and the economic underdevelopment and political fragility of several Sahelian countries. The attack on an oil and gas facility in Amenas, Algeria in January demonstrated a new willingness to directly attack major Western economic interests. In Nigeria, a loosely organized collection of factions known collectively as Boko Haram has carried out attacks primarily against Nigerian targets, but also against Western and international interests. It has attempted to exploit economic and political grievances of northern populations to garner recruits and public sympathy. Members of Boko Haram have launched improvised explosive device and other types of terror attacks against civilian targets and Nigerian security units. A splinter organization, Ansaru, has explicitly targeted Westerners and may have closer ties to al-Qaeda affiliates than the other Boko Haram factions. In order to understand how the United States has crafted its counterterrorism approach in Africa, it's important to begin with the core policy guidance on our overall objectives in Africa. On June 14, 2012, the President issued the U.S. Strategy toward Sub-Saharan Africa, which sets forth 4 strategic objectives. 1, strengthening democratic institutions, improving governance, and protecting human rights. 2, spurring economic growth, trade, and investment. 3, advancing peace and security. And 4, promoting opportunity and development. Another critical piece of guidance comes from the 2012 U.S. Defense Strategy that directs, and I quote, "The United States will emphasize building the capacity of partners and allies to more effectively defend their own territory and interests through better use of diplomacy, development, and security force assistance. And finally, the National Strategy for Counterterrorism states, U.S. counterterrorism efforts require a multi-departmental and multinational effort that goes beyond traditional intelligence, military, and law enforcement functions. We are engaged in a broad, sustained, and integrated campaign that harnesses every tool of American power, military, civilian, and the power of our values, together with the concerted efforts of allies, partners, and multilateral institutions. Our approach to the terrorism challenge in Africa reflects our recognition that a comprehensive, long-term approach is required to address insecurity on the continent, and that military solutions alone are insufficient and at times counterproductive. We've learned from experience that the threats in Africa are diverse, and our allies' approaches to these threats reflect a range of perspectives, priorities, and capabilities. So our engagements reflect several fundamental principles. First, regional ownership. The key countries in the affected regions must lead and be seen to be leading. Efforts, and I think that's of critical importance. They must be seen to be leading all efforts to address challenges. Our regional partners have consistently emphasized that Africa's security is the responsibility of the Africans themselves, that it is important that the United States and other international partners maintain supporting roles, and that our African partners take responsibility for their own security. When necessary, we are prepared to respond to imminent threats to American lives and interests, but we must try to avoid the trap of Americanizing or westernizing these counterterrorism fights. Violent extremists in Africa and elsewhere constantly seek to bolster their own legitimacy by attempting to draw us into the conflict, and our African allies have repeatedly stressed the importance of resisting these attempts to provoke counterproductive actions. Supporting regional leadership and engaging with our allies also helps us to understand how our actions could impact long-standing historical issues in individual countries or regions, and the intended or unintended consequences of our policy choices. We've seen a clear expression of this regional ownership in Somalia, as the Somali National Security Forces and the African Union Mission in Somalia, called AMISOM, have expelled al-Shabaab from a number of cities in southern Somalia, including the strategic port city of Kismayo, and helped to create the political stability required for the successful completion of Somalia's political transition in 2012. Similarly, the African-led International Support Mission in Mali, AFISMA, represents a clear statement of intent by Mali's neighbors that Africans are prepared to take responsibility for the defense of their territories and borders. While maintaining a low-visibility supporting role, the United States has nonetheless provided critical support for African and French-led efforts. Our assistance includes logistical support, including food, fuel, water, and airlift, and training for troop contributing countries. Our second fundamental principle is to promote good governance. President Obama's first priority for Africa is to help build strong and stable democracies. Our security engagement cannot be separated from our long-term goals of good governance, civilian control over security forces, and respect for human rights. Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups are drawn to those locations where they can take advantage of political and economic vulnerabilities to safeguard their operations, cross borders with impunity, and attract recruits. They benefit when security forces and border guards lack the necessary training, equipment, intelligence, or mobility to disrupt their activities. Their cause is advanced when human rights abuses undermine the credibility of security forces and governments writ large. Terrorists and criminal organizations also take advantage of weak or corrupt criminal justice systems, unable to effectively investigate, prosecute, and incarcerate criminals. Our counterterrorism support for Somalia is embedded in an overarching policy of support for political, economic, and social reforms to address the underlying sources of violence and strengthen national and regional stability. Achieving political stability, including a Somali government that demonstrates to the broader Somali population that it's a viable alternative to al-Shabaab, will be the best long-term counter to al-Shabaab and other extremist groups. Similarly, promoting democratic governance is an essential priority in areas threatened by AQIM in the Sahel. The region's youthful and internet-linked populations are demanding more transparency from public officials and expanded economic opportunities. These youth are increasingly aware of governance norms elsewhere in the world, and they yearn for the same basic rights in their own societies. Rising governance standards in West Africa, in turn, are placing ever greater value on legitimacy and heightening intolerance of unconstitutional transitions of power. Civil society has grown in breadth, sophistication, and influence over the past few years, and the Sahel's democratic institutions have begun to put down roots. Parliaments have become more capable and autonomous. Independent media is more diverse and accessible than ever, and elections are increasingly common and meaningful. In Mali, we continue to strongly push for inclusive and legitimate elections. We recognize that only a democratically elected government, viewed as legitimate by the Malian people, will have the strength and credibility to address the crises facing the country, as well as the broader Sahel region. USAID plans to provide more than $6 million in electoral programming support focused on key issues such as voter education, technical assistance, and training to the electoral management bodies, national reconciliation, and targeted election support. In Nigeria, the government must effectively engage communities vulnerable to extremist violence and promote the respect for human rights by its security forces, whose heavy-handed tactics and extrajudicial killings reinforce Northerners' concerns that the Nigerian government does not care about them. Our third fundamental principle is to promote development and economic opportunity. It's vital to reinforce the point that investing in economic and social development is crucial for improving the security environment. In the Sahel, efforts to address insecurity are often hampered by poor infrastructure and the inability of national or local authorities to provide adequate services and educational and vocational opportunities in isolated areas. AQIM has attempted to exploit this weakness by providing food and other consumables to generate goodwill. Although AQIM's attempts to recruit in the Sahel have been largely unsuccessful, the limited successes it has had in countries such as Mauritania can largely be traced to its ability to capitalize among the young over insufficient educational and employment opportunities. National and local authorities recognize these vulnerabilities and are often highly motivated to steer their societies in positive directions, and our economic assistance can help. Economic development also requires tearing down walls that stand in the way of progress. The corruption of elites who steal from their people, the red tape that stops an idea from becoming a business, the patronage that distributes wealth based on tribe or sect. We're helping governments by supporting anti-corruption commissions that are developing reforms and activists who use technology to increase transparency and hold government accountable. Our fourth principle is to enhance regional cooperation. Promoting and enabling enhanced regional cooperation to address security threats is an important priority, and despite the success of AMISOM in the East and AFISMA in the West, we have not yet seen the rise of more durable regional or sub-regional organizations that are prepared to lead African counterterrorism efforts. The African Union, ECOWAS, SADC, and other organizations have demonstrated that they can provide important leadership on some political and economic issues, but they can provide more leadership in coordinating counterterrorism efforts. We're also looking for opportunities to assist sub-regional counterterrorism capacity building efforts. For instance, we're working with the Intergovernmental Authority on Development's capacity building program against terrorism to conduct programs that are aimed at building national capacity to resist terrorism and promote regional security cooperation through training programs using international, regional, and national experts in East Africa. The United States has made a long-term commitment to working with our African partners to address immediate threats and also build durable security sector and development institutions required to achieve counterterrorism objectives. We recognize that we cannot rely on shortcuts when confronting the terrorism challenge in Africa, and will instead work closely with our partners to build long-term capacity in the region to frustrate al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Our primary programs are the Partnership for Regional East Africa Counterterrorism, or PREACT, and the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, or TSCTP, in West Africa. PREACT is the U.S. government strategy for long-term engagement and capacity building in a dozen East African countries to combat evolving terrorism threats in and emanating from the Horn of Africa and along the Swahili coast. The TSCTP is our primary vehicle to support long-term capabilities of 10 countries in West and North Africa to address the AQIM threat. TSCTP is designed to support regional partner efforts in the Sahel to build long-term capacity to contain and marginalize terrorist organizations and facilitation networks, to disrupt efforts to recruit, train, and provision terrorists and extremists, to counter efforts to establish safe havens for terrorist organizations, and disrupt foreign fighter networks that may attempt to operate outside the region. PREACT and TSCTP serve two primary purposes. The interagency identifies and mobilizes resources to support sustained efforts to address violent extremism in the region for these two programs, which reflect our recognition that sporadic engagements without follow-up or sustainment will fail to achieve meaningful long-term results. Individual activities supported by PREACT and TSCTP draw resources and expertise from multiple agencies in the U.S. government, including the State Department, the Department of Defense, and USAID. They're also designed to assist efforts to coordinate the activities of the various implementing agencies within the U.S. government. Action officers representing various agencies meet periodically in Washington to coordinate activities and share information. Representatives from Washington, the U.S. military's Africa Command, meet regularly with our embassies in PREACT and TSCTP countries, where the first line of coordination and oversight takes place in our embassies. And while various inputs and assessments from throughout the interagency inform decisions regarding counterterrorism programming, chiefs of mission, generally ambassadors, must concur with all proposed activities. They're ultimately the primary interlocutors with host countries and are responsible for implementing a cohesive policy. In conclusion, let me reemphasize that the Department has been working on counterterrorism in Africa in terms of decades. Our approach crosses over U.S. administrations and has remained remarkably stable and consistent. While there have been setbacks, like the collapse in Mali, there have been successes as well, such as the ability of other partners in the Sahel to contain violent extremists to northern Mali. We have willing partners in the region that have consistently rejected the tactics and ideology put forward by al-Qaeda and other violent extremist groups. We recognize that there are no quick wins, to use a Washington buzzword going around these days. We also recognize that we cannot and should not take the lead in every fight. While we must do our part and contribute wherever possible, our regional partners and Western allies are often better situated to confront terrorism challenges. Thank you very much for your patience today, for your time, and most importantly, I really welcome your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for what I think was a wonderful overview and with the right amount of detail. The floor is open for questions. Yes, sir. The questioner is asking whether we could have a comparison between the advantages under colonial rule versus the advantages under non-colonial rule, and appraise whether indeed the transition has been extraordinarily helpful or not.
It's an interesting question, and no, seriously, and I think it's a good one. I mean, and I think how you approach it would probably depend on where you come from. I will say this: plenty of Africans ask a similar question. Although interestingly, I don't think what you don't hear. I've not heard any significant number of Africans anywhere calling for a return to colonialism. I've not heard any significant number of Africans say we shouldn't have gotten independence. However, you will hear plenty of Africans and many African leaders questioning why they have not done better with their own independence. You will hear plenty of Africans asking how it is that at the time of independence, approximately 50 years ago, many Africans will say, 50 years ago, countries like Ghana and Uganda were on an economic par with countries like Malaysia or Korea, more or less, per capita income and the like. And many Africans will say, now how is it, and in fact, 50 years ago at that time, a lot of the conventional wisdom was that the African countries would develop more rapidly than the Asian counterparts because the African countries were rich in natural resources, and many of these Asian countries were not. And plenty of Africans will say, what happened in the post-colonial era? How is it that these Asian countries pulled so far ahead and we did not move ahead in the numbers that in the way that we would have liked or have expected? So plenty of Africans seem to be willing to ask this question. But I will say this, that I think Africans, certainly like we Americans, and again, it's hard to generalize about an entire continent, but I will say this, that in my experiences in East and Southern and West Africa, Africans also are a bit like Americans in the sense that they're pretty much individuals, and most of them will say, I'd rather make my own mistakes on my own and be, and have responsibility for my own life and fail than be sort of dictated to by someone else and succeed. And that kind of stubbornness is something that I personally understand. But what I'll say is I think plenty of Africans are asking that same question about why they haven't made the progress they would like. But I don't think anyone is really saying we should not have had independence. I think people will ask hard questions about what they themselves needed to do to succeed.
The question is, would you comment upon a profound misconception of the roots of 9/11? And if you could give us some insight as to why they seem to be pervasive.
Well, let me start out by saying I think that around the world, conspiracy theories have their proponents. A lot of people in a lot of places believe some very strange things. I think there's a wonderful word in Arabic, mu'amara, which means conspiracy, and you hear it a lot. And the rumor mill in a lot of countries is the national sport right behind soccer. And what I would say is that in my experience, certainly you'll find some people who believe in some very odd conspiracy theories about whether it be about 9/11 or any number of other things. And if you get on the internet, you'll find plenty of Americans who will assert all sorts of strange things about all sorts of odd topics as well. What I would say about the Sahel certainly is that it's a huge area, and it encompasses a number of countries and a lot of people, some of whom are bound to have some very strange ideas. But what I will say that I think is interesting is that, in fact, we've conducted polling in much of West Africa, and Americans in the United States are actually quite well regarded. And I'll also say that I think that the people in the Sahel, by and large, have been quite clear in their rejection of extremist ideology. I think one of the most remarkable things that we've seen in recent months is that when violent extremists and religious extremists took over places like Timbuktu, that the population did not embrace them and their ideology, and that in fact when African and French forces liberated these towns in northern Mali, people came out and said, and expressed great thanks for what they viewed as liberation, and a return of the kind of moderate Islam that's really local to the area. Islam is not monolithic, and the practices of of people in West Africa vary from place to place, but most of them are not great extremists, and I don't think most people, view 9/11 events as either a cause or even anything of great relationship to their immediate situation.
How hostile are terrorists to Chinese?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think China is certainly an important player in Africa. The Chinese are active, they're dynamic, they're extremely involved in business and in business ventures on the continent. What I would say is that I think that the extremist groups that we've mostly been focusing on today, groups like AQIM or Al-Shabaab, I think many of them have probably not been active in countries where the Chinese are terribly active. But the Chinese have certainly been victims of violence. I don't know that I would call it terrorism, but Chinese workers certainly are affected by instability in places like Sudan. There have been kidnappings of Chinese workers, and I don't think the Chinese are immune to it, but part of it is geographic. Also, part of it is that I think what I would say is that if you read the rhetoric of many of the extremist groups, it tends to focus on the United States rather than China. Although I think that China's own ethnic minority Muslims might, some of them are also attracted to extremist groups. So no, they have not. I've not seen large numbers of this, but some of that may be geographic. What I will say though is that that I think that China's policies in Africa are raising their own questions among Africans. I think there are a lot of Africans. There was a pretty interesting piece written by the Nigerian central bank governor recently about Chinese business practices in Africa, and I think there are a lot of people who are beginning to question some of the Chinese practices in business in Africa. For example, the use of bringing in large numbers of Chinese laborers. A lot of African labor unions and the like are questioning these sorts of things. So, no, not to my knowledge. So.
At least two questions, I think, Mr. Smore. But one is, what is the role or place of Al Qaeda within the whole network of or array of extremist tendencies? And secondly, what is the American national interest within Africa?
I think that the short answer to both of those questions is to say that terrorism and extremism come in all sorts of gradations in Africa and around the world. But the U.S. focus on al-Qaeda is largely because it's al-Qaeda that has presented the most clear, direct, and physical threat to the United States. There are lots of terrorist groups in Africa that have no relationship to al-Qaeda whatsoever, and that may pose no real threat to the United States. So our focus on those kinds of terrorist groups will necessarily be different than it might be against a clear al-Qaeda affiliate. And what I would say is that I believe that links of groups like Al-Shabaab or AQIM and the threats that they present to Americans, to American interests, are pretty clear. So I don't feel that there's any exaggeration in talking about the kinds of threats they present to us and the way we respond to them. I think there are other groups, like the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda, that's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of children, and commits, some of the most grossly. I fail to find words to describe what the Lord's Resistance Army has done to people in northern Uganda, parts of Sudan, parts of the Central African Republic, and the Congo. Now, I'll be honest, I see no al-Qaeda link, and I don't think that they pose a direct threat to the United States. That said, what they do is so awful that the United States has joined up with African countries to try and combat this threat. I'll say that even if extremist groups don't threaten the United States and they do threaten locals, with real terrorism, with imposing an extremism on them that they want to resist, then I think that it is often in our interest to make sure that those groups don't get a foothold, because I think, as we found with places like Afghanistan or parts of Somalia, that if extremist groups do get that foothold, the kinds of groups that will be attracted to those places can in fact threaten the United States later. That said, I think it is very important that we not allow ourselves to find al-Qaeda, as some kind of a boogeyman behind every group that's bad or every group that threatens us. And it's especially important, I made reference to this, that one of the reasons that it's especially important that we not in fact allow ourselves to get drawn into different kinds of conflicts that in fact are not about that kind of extremism. One of the reasons I think I mentioned when I was speaking that we need to have local partners and that we should have our local partners playing the leading role is because, in fact, we don't want to get sucked into some kinds of long-term crises. Mali is a very good example. There are probably 4 different crises going on in Mali all at the same time right now. One of them involves largely externally driven extremists who are affiliated with groups I think outside Mali, whose extremist vision is not only alien to Mali, but I think threatening to U.S. interests, and which the people of Mali have resoundingly rejected. That's only one part of their conflict right now. You also have a much longer-term north-south conflict in Mali that involves a number of northern tribes. In the media, they usually simplify it down to just the Tuareg, but it's not. There are a lot of northern groups that have long-term differences with their government. And in fact, they were fighting against the government. It was a combination of a temporary link-up between them and some of these extremist groups, a combination of fighters coming out of Libya with training and arms coming into Mali, and then in combination with a third crisis, which is that the Malian army led a military coup against its civilian government at the same time, which diverted focus from these other fights, that led to these 3 things combined with a fourth crisis, a humanitarian crisis, to put Mali in the position that it's in today. Now, what I'll say is, I think that the United States and many other countries have come together to fight this extremist threat in Mali. We and other countries are not interested in engaging in the traditional north-south dispute in Mali. And in fact, this is why, one, we have encouraged both the Malians and those parties in the north that are fighting to sit down and negotiate an end to their conflicts. The Malians have done this in the past, and I think we feel that certainly the Malian government should be negotiating with those groups that repudiate terrorism and terrorist violence and recognize the territorial sovereignty of Mali. Those groups that do not reject those things will probably have to be dealt with militarily. We also think that it's critical that the Malians hold a credible election so that they can have a democratically elected government to hold these negotiations. So I think we do recognize the complexities of these many, many different conflicts, and while we want to address some of them, we also realize that others, A, are not fundamentally our business, B, are not the kinds of conflicts that we will have a lot of traction in. Malians will have to resolve, for example, their long-standing north-south conflict on their own.
The question was, would you comment upon the countries which are working with us in Africa, and not just the African countries, but countries from outside of Africa as well?
Actually, I think what's remarkable is the degree to which there's been very extensive international cooperation on these issues. Obviously, it's different countries in places like Somalia than it is in Mali, for example. In Mali, obviously, the outside intervention has been led mostly by the French. But we provided extensive support to the French, as have a number of European countries. And frankly, I couldn't even. There are enough of them that I'm not sure I can begin to name them all. I know that the British have been very active. I know that the Canadians have been very active. But frankly, let me stress that the bulk of beyond the French, what the French are getting is support from other countries. But you said specifically the European or Middle Eastern. Let me mention that the bulk of the troops and a lot of the drive there has been from the neighboring African countries. The first group to call for troops was the Nigerians, and you see Nigerian, Chadian, I think Nigerian, I think the Ghanaians, the Senegalese, I believe the Ivorian, and any number of other African countries have also been extremely involved. So I think I don't want to give them short shrift. In Somalia, I want to say I think in the counter-piracy effort alone, which has been a real success story, but in the counter-piracy effort in Somalia, I believe there's something like 17 different countries involved in that now, to include the Chinese and the Russians. It's very, very substantial numbers. And one of the things that I think is remarkable is that, particularly in terms of the regional response, in Somalia, the AMISOM forces involve mostly regional forces. The Ugandans, there are Burundians, Kenyans, and allied Ethiopian forces. These are mostly forces from the region involved. So they have, in many cases, a real cultural knowledge of what they're involved in. And also, I think it shows a recognition that these countries know it's not in their interest to allow extremism and instability to really take root in their area.
Would you comment upon the difference, the way we react to conflicts which are essentially tribal versus conflicts which involve Islam?
I think that in this case, I would go back to where I was a few questions ago and say I think that some of our response in Mali is really about the fact that it involves groups that we perceive threaten the U.S. or U.S. interests, and their alliances involve that kind of threat. I will say, first of all, let me raise some disagreement with the idea that we didn't do anything in Côte d'Ivoire. We did not intervene militarily in Côte d'Ivoire, but we viewed for those of you who are not familiar with the situation, Côte d'Ivoire has on and off had a rebellion for a number of years, but most recently the fighting in Côte d'Ivoire was sparked by then President Gbagbo's refusal to recognize the results of an election that he lost, and that President-elect Ouattara was believed to have won the election. As I recall, when the electoral officials were there to read out the results, someone came up and sort of tore the paper up in front of people. Pretty dramatic stuff. And I think that in this case, we were very, very much involved in supporting President Ouattara's legitimate ascension to the presidency. And our feeling was that it was a different kind of threat. And in this case, the threat was not, it didn't involve external or terrorist groups, but I think there was very much a feeling that if an incumbent president could so dramatically ignore the results of a democratic election, that the precedent it would set for the continent and for democracy on the continent would be devastatingly bad. So we were involved. But I think what I would say is that, first of all, we are not seeking to have the limelight or be upfront in every conflict that exists. And we're regional actors, and in the case of Côte d'Ivoire, the French were there. They had troops in place. But also the Economic Community of West African States really did step up to the plate to call for a respect for the results of the elections, which was ultimately successful. Former President Gbagbo is, of course, now in custody in The Hague, awaiting trial by the International Criminal Court. So, I think that worked out quite well, and I would say that if our role is not particularly visible, please don't assume that means it's non-existent. So I think that, but what I would say, to get back to where we were, I think that our response in a place like Mali is really about this perception that were Bamako to fall, and Mali to become something along the lines of an Afghanistan or a Somalia, it would be very, very fundamentally not in our national interests.
The question refers back to an earlier question, and it is if the African countries haven't done as well as they would like to have done. That's the question, and the answer is they don't have an institutional structure, the proposed answer is, and would you agree that that in fact is the first answer, and if it is, what do we do about it?
I think it's very difficult to generalize about the large number of countries in Africa. And let's face it, some African countries are quite economically successful. So countries succeed or fail for a lot of different reasons. Some of them, I would say that certainly for some of them, institutional weakness played a role. Certainly for some of them, infrastructural weakness played a substantial role. I think for a number of them, simply bad economic decisions and policies played a very major role. Corruption probably is a fundamental role in many of them, but not all. I don't think you can really characterize that. I think we look at it from a country-by-country basis, and where it's infrastructure, we may try to work with them on infrastructure. These days, one of our biggest programs is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where we sit down and let them tell us where they think the effort to develop needs to be made. But in other countries, it might be about regulation or policy. In some, as I said, infrastructure. It can be any number of things. What I will say is that today, I think 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies around the world are African. And there are a number of countries that are doing remarkably well these days. And, sometimes from quite a low base. Let's be honest. Obviously, when you're a larger, more mature economy, it takes it's much more difficult to grow at a high rate. When you're a small and developing economy, you do have the opportunity to have double-digit growth rates. But a number, as I said, 7 of, I think, the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. I'm just coming out of Ghana, where the economy's been booming. So I think that despite the many challenges and the many problems of the past, a lot of countries in Africa are certainly getting a goodly number of things right.
The question is, first of all, how many diplomats do we have to protect in Africa? Secondly, how do we protect them? And if they need help in an emergency, how do they get it?
So that's an interesting question, and let me just say, one I take personally. It's something I've had to live with for a lot of years. Let me just say, I think, in fact, just as I was on my way here, I was listening to the news, and they were talking about President Obama making some proposals for increased diplomatic security, which I hope we will get. In all seriousness, security for our diplomats and our facilities is something that I've had to live with pretty much every day for the last 27 years. And let me just say, one, I was assigned to the embassy in Nairobi during that bombing. I served in Somalia, where we got shot at a lot, and I had a number of friends shot and a goodly number of friends killed. I served in Lebanon, where we have a long history of tragedy and difficulty. I also served in Sudan, where security was pretty constantly an issue. So it's something that, and even in a number of other countries, when I was in Uganda, we had multiple insurgencies in the west and the north. We had bombings before, and we have had bombings since. And this is something that if you join the Foreign Service, is a fact of life. And there's a lot of attention being paid to it these days, and certainly post 9/11. But in the State Department and not just the State Department and the Foreign Service, but in our embassies, which involve other agencies, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and sometimes our military colleagues who are assigned to the embassy, and any number of other government agencies. This is something we've been dealing with for a long time, from long before 9/11. Sadly, many of us overseas have spent a lot of our time trying to create security for America, to work on issues of terrorism so that we wouldn't face things like 9/11 back home. But let me just say that, in my time, we've had multiple embassy bombings. We have large numbers of attacks on embassies that nobody ever hears about. And sadly, substantial numbers of my colleagues die. It's a dangerous job. And I say this, let me say, sir, first of all, I think those of us who join the Foreign Service accept that a substantial amount of risk comes with the job.
What are your recommendations
Sir, please.
to improve the security of our people over there?
Let me say first, I think that all of us who join these days knowing that there is a substantial amount of risk attached to the job. And that isn't, I will get to an answer, sir, if you'll allow me to finish. May I? Thank you. First of all, we accept a certain amount of risk, and that a certain amount of risk is inherent in getting the job done. That you can't do the job if you're locked behind a wall, if you never talk to people, if you never see them, it is not possible to do the job. What we want to do is weigh our risks and rewards. We don't want anyone to be in harm's way for no reason. But when what we do supports the national interest, makes Americans safer or healthier or better off in their lives, then certain amounts of risk are inevitable and should be acceptable. Now, that said, traditionally, one of the bedrock assumptions of running an embassy and having diplomats in a foreign country is that you rely on the host government to provide security for your diplomatic facilities. That traditionally it has been our belief that you could not provide enough security from outside to make an embassy safe if your host government were not committed to making that happen. I think it's only in recent years, as we've found ourselves in both very different circumstances in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where governments were not capable, and as we've increasingly faced a growing threat from global terrorism. But let me point out, we faced that threat from global terrorism for many, many years before now. So I think we can talk about what we can do. Can we put more Marines into our embassies? Can we put bigger walls outside of the of the building? Can we get heavier armor installed in our cars? Are we all going to walk around all day, every day, wearing ballistic vests? I mean, yes, there are things you can do, and some of them will incrementally bring more security. But the fact of the matter is, you can't ever make everyone perfectly safe. And the fact of the matter is that the job involves risks, and I think the most important thing is that we make the judgment that the work that's being done merits those risks. I don't think we can make it perfectly safe. I've lost a lot of friends in this business. I don't want it to sound like I'm somehow minimizing the impact of security or that anyone values it more than I do. But I will say this. I think that when it happens, the first question Foreign Service officers ask is, was it worth it? Were we there for a good reason? Were people doing what was important and valuable? And yes, are we taking appropriate steps to make people safe? Do we have the resources we need? I mean, those are important things, and we can always use more resources for security. But resources are finite. We have to be honest. We live in if you could give me if you could give me 100 times my security budget, I'd find ways to spend it. But there are limits to what we can do, and I have to be honest. I'm not trying to avoid your question, but I think I have to say, one, a certain amount of risk is implicit in the job. If you look back at our history, if you go to the wall at the State Department, ambassadors and Foreign Service people, not just from the State Department, from other agencies as well, this is not something new for us.
Which African country do you think is the most successful, and why?
Do you have children, sir? Which is your favorite? I think it's it really depends on what standards you take. I mean, I have to say that if you can certainly take some hard numbers and say, well, who has the biggest GDP, or who has this or that, and come up with all sorts of different answers. If it's about something like GDP, it's going to be South Africa or a Botswana or maybe a Namibia, something like this. Or you can talk about who has the most peaceful, transitions of power in terms of democracy. You can come up with all sorts of things and all sorts of different answers. But I think, what I would say in many ways, I'm one of those guys who always roots for the underdog. And having gone to UVA, you get a lot of experience with that sometimes. But what I'll say is that I actually have a lot of respect for countries like Sierra Leone. And I'm not going to say that's, is it, in these measurable terms that I was just talking about, is it the most successful? No. But when you look at where they were just a few years ago, one of the most brutal, horrible civil wars on the continent, and you look at where they are today, rapidly growing, just had a good election, kind of on their feet and moving forward, I think that's really remarkable. When you look at what a lot of countries, that went backwards at some point have done to turn that around, like Sierra Leone, and there are a number of examples like that, I think that actually, for me, invites a lot of credit and respect. But they wouldn't win on any of these sort of, pick the hard numbers terms. So it's kind of a non-answer, but that's what you'll get out of me tonight.
Does Iran finance terrorist operations in Africa?
I think we are extremely concerned about Iranian and Iranian Revolutionary Guard activities around the globe. They are, I think if you look at recent reports out of Europe of Iranian activities, places like Cyprus, you can see the activity levels globally. And Africa is no exception to that, although at least in places like Somalia and Mali, these are not, I don't think the Iranians are a fundamental driver in those, but we remain very concerned about Iranian activities around the globe, and Africa is no exception.
Is there any indication of a trend of any kind in Africa of the inspired individual terrorist as opposed to organized terrorism? And if so, what does one do about it?
I don't think, at least to my knowledge, that has not been a significant trend yet in Africa. I think that now it doesn't mean that organizations are monolithic or that there aren't factions or that the scene isn't very, very complex. But no, I don't think individuals have been the major factor.
Well, I apologize to everybody for having to call this to an end. I was thinking that's silly of me. If I really could control time, I know what I would do with it. In any case, this has been a spectacular evening. We thank you very much.
And let me thank all of you both for your interest and your attendance and your questions.